Hello, and welcome to Catholicism in the Car. My name is Parker Zerbal. Alright, so I want to continue our discussion on how we can further a more reverent outlook upon the Eucharist. Okay? Last time we talked a lot about Eucharistic ministers, and also so we talked about extraordinary Eucharistic ministers as opposed to ordinary ministers of the Eucharist. The ordinary ministers are the clergy, either a deacon, priest, or bishop, and I think this time it might be worth talking a little bit more about the laity's reception, and then maybe we will discuss some other things as well. So first and foremost, I want to discuss the practice of receiving communion in the hand. As I mentioned last time, it kind of arose amongst some very interesting circumstances. To my knowledge, there were, I believe it was in France, there were a number of parishes who started to receive on the hand without permission from the Holy See. So this was pretty soon after the Second Vatican Council. I want to say in the early 1970s, maybe late 1960s, so right after the council. They started receiving on the hand in defiance to the Holy See, because the Vatican had said that people were to continue receiving on the tongue. I believe at that time they did start receiving while standing, because in a lot of places the communion rail was done away with. And I don't believe there was actually any documentation regarding the removal of the communion rail. I might be wrong on that. I'll have to check with some sources, maybe some other people. So the original instance of this in the late 1960s, early 1970s, was actually done in defiance of the Holy See. And what happened is it actually became so pernicious of a defiance where almost everyone in this country was receiving on the hand, and priests and bishops were doing it left and right. And so what the Holy See did out of compassion was to then give an exception to that particular country. And by the way, I'm getting this kind of off of memory from a podcast a couple friends of mine run. It's called the Deus Vult podcast. Deus Vult, meaning in Latin, God wills it. And so it was Father Daniel Kale and Father Stephen Felicia run that podcast. This was what Father Daniel Kale was saying regarding the issue. So you can probably find that episode and get the more accurate story here. But it was originally done in defiance to the Holy See. The Vatican kind of allowed for it out of mercy for these people. I don't know. We can argue whether that was actually a truly merciful thing to do or not. Is it merciful to let people persist in defiance to you? Probably not. Sounds more like giving in to me. But anyway, I wasn't there. I wasn't making the shots, so it's hard to judge the situation. And from there, it kind of spread, and many more exceptions were given for many different regions, and eventually it just became common practice in many places. But as far as I know, every single instance where the Vatican gave this exception for receiving communion on the hand, it had said that the people should not grasp for the sacrament, and also that it should be recepted as worthily as possible, with as much reverence as possible. And I believe it's the Coptic Church, which is the Egyptian Oriental Orthodox Church, also known as the Coptic Oriental Orthodox Church. They get their lineage from Mark the Evangelist. So their patriarch, who actually goes by the title Pope, is an apostolic successor of Mark the Evangelist. And Mark was a disciple of Peter, so a lot of people will say that the Coptic patriarch does sort of trace himself back to Peter in that certain sense. Now they don't claim the primacy that Rome has. They do understand that distinction, as do really all the Orthodox. They still understand that the Roman See has primacy, but they just think that in the absence of the Roman See, because they some of them consider the Roman See to be in schism, right, and heresy kind of. So they consider the second See in the hierarchy to be Constantinople, and therefore Constantinople is the ecumenical patriarchate of the Orthodox world. Anyway, the Coptic Orthodox, and also I believe Coptic Catholics as well, they're Eastern Catholics, their normal practice is to receive on the hand. But it's very interesting. What they do is they put basically a corporal, so a cloth, over their hands, and then what they do is they bring their head down to their hands and lick the Blessed Sacrament off of that corporal. So they're never actually touching the Blessed Sacrament. And that's kind of that's the key here. That's the common denominator amongst all tradition, whether Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, or Catholic. All the traditions, the layperson does not touch the sacrament. This is another reason why extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion should be used incredibly sparingly, if at all, because the whole rationale here for not having laity touch the sacrament is because it is God. It is Jesus Christ sacramentally present on the altar, really, truly, and sacramentally present. Okay? It shouldn't just be any person willy-nilly being able to touch the sacrament, ideally speaking, right? I mean, in certain extreme circumstances, of course, a faithful layperson will want to protect the sacrament, and in that case need to probably touch it. But on the ordinary, normal circumstances, it should only be a clergyman who touches it, because of the holiness of the sacrament. There's a reason in the Old Testament why if anyone unworthy who was not a Levite touched the Ark of the Covenant, which just held things that were very holy and kind of had like the presence of God in a looser way connected to it, that they died if they touched it. If they touched the Ark of the Covenant, they died. This is why when priests would go into the Holy of Holies, the high priest would have a chain around his waist and bells on all of his vestments, so that the people outside the Holy of Holies would know if he died in there, that they could tell, because the bells would stop, and then they could pull him out with the chain. They could pull his body out, or else they would have to wait for a new high priest to go in there and retrieve the body. And people will say, "Oh, well, it's the new covenant. Like, we're supposed to be really close to God." And yes, in a real sense, but that also, does that mean people weren't able to have real relationships with God in the Old Covenant? I mean, I think it's very clear that people like Elijah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, many of these prophets, and many of the priests had real deep relationships with God the Father and the Trinity in the way that they knew it, even in the Old Covenant. And yes, by the cross of Christ, we can draw closer to Him in the sense that we can now receive the beatific vision. But I would argue that doesn't mean we now have a buddy-buddy relationship with God. I would say in a lot of ways, our day-to-day prayer relationship hasn't changed a ton from the Old Testament to now. there were even ways, at least in my understanding, that I've heard that in the Old Testament they even had a certain sense to where the person could be kind of quasi deified, in a sense, quasi sanctified. You look at all the miracles that many of these people wrought. You also look at people like Enoch in the book of Genesis, who was so close with God that God assumed him into heaven at the end of his life. I mean, my goodness, that's pretty dang holy. So there's even people that would argue that Enoch must have been immaculately conceived in some sort of way for that to have happened. Like, he was an exception as Mary was an exception. And you also talk about was it Elijah or Elisha? I always get them mixed up. Which one came first? I think it was Elijah that came first, and Elisha was his disciple. I might have that backwards. Sorry, that shows the extent of my knowledge of Scripture. I mean, I think I have a pretty decent grasp of Scripture, but it shows. I mean, I haven't been in those books of the Old Testament. So, and Elijah was taken up to heaven in a fiery chariot, right? Like, it was pretty clear he didn't die. So, like, what happened there? It's kind of a question. And people that say that the Assumption of Mary is such a unique thing, I don't think that they take into account those previous examples of Enoch and Elijah, where like these people didn't die. They were basically assumed into heaven, just as Mary was. I mean, it's not like Mary is the only example of this throughout salvation history, and those examples are attested to in Scripture. So it shouldn't be that hard to get on board with that. Anyway. Oh, real quick, please feel free to subscribe to any of my podcasts on any of the podcast players. Find me on YouTube. Please subscribe. Like me on Facebook, like the Catholicism Card channel on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We're all there. Catholicism Card. And then I also have a Patreon account if you wish to support what I do at this podcast and this YouTube channel. And you can also support us on Anchor.fm. There's a support button there you click on. I also have links to all of this on my website's support page at www.catholicisminthecard.com.